Hello, and welcome to the channel. The story you're about to hear is about the strangest exit strategy in Hollywood history. When the stars who gave us immortality on screen tried to vanish from life itself. What drives a person to fake their own death when the world adores them? Why would someone at the peak of fame choose oblivion? Picture this: a soundstage in 1927, flooded with blinding Klieg lights. The heat is unbearable. The star stands perfectly still for what feels like an eternity, while the camera rolls, capturing every bead of sweat, every forced smile. The director yells "cut," and for a moment the star can breathe. But only for a moment, because outside, beyond the studio gates, thousands wait with autograph books and cameras. They want a piece of him. They always want a piece. This was the reality of early Hollywood fame, a gilded cage that grew smaller with each passing year. The stars of the silent era and the golden age were the first humans to experience celebrity on a truly mass scale. Their faces appeared in newspapers from New York to Tokyo. Strangers felt they knew them intimately, felt entitled to their time, their attention, their very souls. There was no precedent for this kind of existence, no roadmap for staying sane under such relentless scrutiny. The studio system treated actors like property. 7-year contracts bound them to a single studio, which controlled everything: what films they made, who they were seen with, even what they said in interviews. A manufactured persona was built around each star, often bearing little resemblance to the actual human being underneath. The sweet girl next door might have been a sharp-tongued intellectual. The rugged cowboy might have preferred poetry to horseback riding. It didn't matter. The studio knew what sold tickets, and that's who you became. Some stars thrived under this system. Others suffocated. For those who suffocated, the options were limited. You couldn't simply quit. The studio would sue you into oblivion and blacklist you from ever working again. You couldn't retreat from public life while still working. Your contract required promotional appearances, carefully staged candid photographs, participation in the publicity machine that fed the industry. You were trapped in a role you played 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no escape in sight. Unless, of course, you died. Death was the only contract the studios couldn't enforce. Death ended obligations, stopped the cameras, closed the gates. More importantly, death transformed you from property into legend. A dead star couldn't be controlled, manipulated, or exploited, at least not in the same way. They became frozen in time, forever young, forever perfect, forever beyond reach. Some stars noticed this. They noticed how Rudolph Valentino's death in 1926 had sparked riots and mass hysteria, how his funeral drew over 100,000 mourners, how his image became more valuable after his death than it ever was during his life. They noticed how the studios spoke of their deceased stars with a reverence they never showed the living ones. Death, it seemed, was the ultimate career move. But what if you wanted the benefits of death? The freedom, the release, the end of obligations, without the inconvenient reality of actually dying? What if you could orchestrate your own disappearance, let the world mourn you, and then slip away to live the life you'd always wanted? What if you could have both, the legend and the liberty? This wasn't an easy thing to accomplish. Faking your death in the 1920s, 30s, or 40s required meticulous planning, trusted accomplices, and often a good deal of luck. You needed fake documents, a believable scenario, and most crucially, someone willing to help you vanish. Sometimes that someone was a lover, sometimes a family member, sometimes even studio fixers who, for their own reasons, wanted you gone. The methods varied. A car crash over a cliff, where the body was too burned to identify. A drowning, where the body was never recovered. A plane crash in a remote location. A suicide staged so convincingly that even close friends believed it. Each scenario had to be plausible enough to avoid suspicion, but dramatic enough to prevent extensive investigation. The goal was a closed casket, minimal autopsy, and a quick burial before too many questions could be asked. And yet, despite the risks and difficulties, some succeeded. They walked away from fame, from fortune, from the names that had defined them, and disappeared into anonymity. Some lived out their days in small towns under assumed names. Others fled to foreign countries where Hollywood glamour meant nothing. They became shopkeepers, teachers, bartenders. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, their famous faces hidden behind time and deliberate obscurity. The question that haunts these stories isn't whether they succeeded in faking their deaths. Historical evidence, deathbed confessions, and investigative journalism have confirmed that some did. The real question is why? Why give up everything? Why choose obscurity over adoration? Why risk criminal charges, hurt your loved ones, and destroy your legacy for a chance at an ordinary life? The answers are as varied as the individuals themselves. For some, it was the unbearable pressure of fame. For others, a desire to escape scandal or persecution. Some wanted to live freely as their authentic selves in an era that demanded rigid conformity. Others simply grew tired of the performance, the endless pretending, the weight of being someone else's fantasy. What connects them all is this. They reached a point where death seemed easier than the life they were living. And in choosing death, or rather, the appearance of death, they found something they'd lost long ago. They found themselves. This is their story. These are the ghosts who walked away from immortality to reclaim their mortality. The stars who realized that fame, for all its glitter, was just another kind of dying, a slow erasure of the person you used to be. And who decided that if they had to choose between dying in the spotlight or disappearing into shadow, they'd take the shadow every time. The first movie stars didn't know they were signing away their lives. They thought they were signing contracts for film work, nothing more. 7 years seemed like a reasonable commitment in exchange for steady employment and the chance to act in motion pictures. What they didn't understand was that the contract covered more than their working hours. It covered everything. Mary Pickford understood this better than most. By 1920, she was the most famous woman in the world, co-founder of United Artists, and one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. But even she had paid the price. She had wanted to play mature, dramatic roles for years, but the public wouldn't allow it. They wanted little Mary, the girl with golden curls and innocent smile. When she finally cut her hair in 1928, fans sent letters of outrage. Some threatened suicide. She was 35 years old, but America demanded she remain 12 forever. This was the paradox of early Hollywood fame. The more successful you became, the less you belonged to yourself. Studios hired private detectives to follow their stars, documenting every move, every relationship, every private moment. Not for blackmail, or not only for blackmail, but for control. Knowledge was power, and knowing your star's secrets meant you could keep them in line. Step out of line, refuse a role, make demands. And suddenly, those secrets might find their way into the scandal magazines that lurked at the edges of respectability, ready to destroy careers with a single headline. The contracts themselves were masterpieces of legal bondage. They specified not just what films you'd make, but how many public appearances you'd attend, what charitable causes you'd support, even who you could marry. Some contracts included morality clauses that gave studios the right to terminate and sue if you engaged in any behavior deemed inappropriate. Inappropriate was broadly defined. It could mean anything the studio wanted it to mean. Wallace Reed was a case study in what happened when a star broke down under the pressure. Handsome, charming, and enormously popular, Reed made over 100 films in his short career. He worked constantly, sometimes appearing in multiple films released the same month. When he was injured on set in 1919, the studio doctor gave him morphine for the pain, then gave him more and more. By 1922, Reed was a morphine addict, barely functional, trapped in a cycle of work and drugs that the studio carefully concealed from the public. When Reed's wife finally forced the truth into the open, demanding he be allowed to seek treatment, the studio was furious. They'd invested millions in his image. His addiction made that investment vulnerable. Reed died in a sanitarium in 1923, age 31. His body destroyed by the morphine that had been prescribed to keep him working. The studio released a statement expressing sorrow and surprise, as if they hadn't known, hadn't enabled, hadn't benefited from the very addiction that killed him. This was the machine that ground up stars and spit out legends. It ran on youth, beauty, and the public's insatiable hunger for new faces. Once you entered it, extraction was nearly impossible. The studios owned you in every way that mattered. They controlled your image, your income, your future. Cross them, and they could make you unemployable in Hollywood forever. Obey them, and they'd work you until you collapsed. The psychological toll was immense. Stars developed elaborate coping mechanisms. Some drank, some relied on drugs, cocaine, morphine, barbiturates, all readily available from studio doctors who asked no questions. Some had nervous breakdowns that were carefully hidden from the public, explained away as exhaustion or minor illness. Some simply went numb, performing their roles on and off screen with mechanical precision, their real selves locked away somewhere the cameras couldn't reach. Clara Bow, the it girl of the 1920s, suffered crippling anxiety and insomnia. She'd lie awake for days, terrified of everything and nothing, while the studio sent over pills and told her to pull herself together. She had a film to promote, appearances to make, an image to maintain. Her mental health was irrelevant. Only the performance mattered. John Gilbert, one of the biggest male stars of the silent era, watched his career evaporate overnight when talkies arrived. His voice, perfectly adequate in person, somehow didn't record well. Or perhaps the studio simply decided it didn't, choosing not to invest in helping him adjust to the new technology. Either way, he was finished. By 1936, at age 41, Gilbert was dead from a heart attack. Brought on by years of alcoholism and despair, he'd gone from earning $250,000 per film to being unemployable in less than 5 years. This was the price of immortality. You gave up your privacy, your autonomy, your mental and physical health, your very self. In return, you received fame, fortune, and the promise that you'd live forever on screen. But that immortality belonged to the studios, not to you. They owned the films, the negatives, the images of your face. They could destroy them or preserve them as they saw fit. Your immortality was conditional, dependent on the whims of corporate entities that viewed you as product, not person. Some stars made peace with this bargain. They saw the benefits, wealth, influence, adoration, and decided the costs were acceptable. They built lives within the constraints, found happiness in the margins between publicity and privacy. But others couldn't bear it. They felt themselves disappearing, their real personalities subsumed by the manufactured personas the studios had created. They looked in the mirror and saw strangers wearing their faces. For these stars, the only escape seemed to be death. Not metaphorical death, but actual, physical death. An ending so final that not even the studios could reverse it. Death meant freedom from obligation, release from the endless performance, an exit from the machine that had consumed them. It meant they could finally rest. But death also meant abandoning any chance at the life they might have wanted. It meant surrendering completely, giving the studios and the public exactly what they'd taken everything else, their existence. Some stars looked at this choice, continue suffering or cease existing, and found it wanting. They wanted a third option. They wanted to escape without dying. They wanted to disappear. And so they began to plan. Jean Harlow died on June the 7th, 1937. She was 26 years old. The official cause of death was cerebral edema, brought on by acute nephritis, kidney failure, in plain terms. MGM released a statement expressing profound sorrow. Fans worldwide mourned the loss of the platinum blonde, the girl who'd redefined sex appeal for a generation. Her funeral drew thousands. Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy were among the pallbearers. Everything about it seemed straightforward, tragic, but uncomplicated. Except it wasn't. The first questions came from the doctors who treated her in those final days. Why had treatment been delayed so long? By the time Harlow was hospitalized, her condition was already critical. Where had she been in the days before, when symptoms were surely already manifesting? Her mother, a Christian Scientist who didn't believe in medical treatment, had kept her at home, relying on prayer. But Harlow was an adult, a wealthy woman with access to the best medical care in Los Angeles. Why hadn't she sought help herself? Then there were the inconsistencies in the timeline. Friends who'd seen her days before her hospitalization reported she seemed fine. Tired, perhaps, but nothing suggesting she was dying. 1 week later, she was gone. Kidney failure of that severity typically showed symptoms over weeks or months, not days. Something about the speed of her decline didn't fit the diagnosis. The autopsy, rushed and incomplete, raised more questions than it answered. The examining physicians noted unusual findings, but attributed them to the kidney failure. No one pushed for deeper investigation. MGM wanted the matter closed quickly and quietly. Scandal was bad for business, and questions about Harlow's death threatened to become a scandal because there were other factors at play. Harlow had been working exhaustively in the months before her death, filming Saratoga with Clark Gable. The studio schedule was punishing. Long days, little rest, constant pressure to perform despite obvious illness. Multiple witnesses later reported that Harlow had complained of feeling unwell, but was told to keep working. The film needed to be completed on schedule. Her health was secondary. There was also the matter of her personal life. Harlow had recently married cinematographer Harold Rosson, her third marriage in less than a decade. The marriage was already troubled. Rumors circulated of arguments, infidelity, unhappiness. Some whispered of violence, though nothing was ever substantiated. 2 years earlier, her second husband, Paul Byrne, had died under mysterious circumstances, officially ruled a suicide, though many suspected otherwise. Harlow seemed to attract tragedy. In the years following her death, a persistent conspiracy theory emerged. Harlow hadn't died of natural causes. She'd been poisoned. The theory had several variations. Some claimed her mother, fanatical in her religious beliefs, had refused medical treatment as a form of murder-suicide, wanting her daughter to die pure rather than live sullied by Hollywood. Others suggested MGM had orchestrated her death to avoid a scandal brewing around her personal life. Still others pointed to enemies she'd made in the industry, people who resented her success or felt wronged by her. These theories were mostly dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of grief-stricken fans who couldn't accept that their idol had simply died young. But they persisted, and over decades, small pieces of evidence accumulated that gave them unsettling credibility. In the 1960s, a nurse who'd cared for Harlow in her final days gave an interview claiming the doctors had seemed puzzled by her symptoms. Her condition had suddenly worsened in ways that surprised the medical staff. The implication was clear. Something unexpected had happened. Then there were the sightings. A doctor in Mexico City reported treating an American woman in 1939 who bore a striking resemblance to Harlow. A teacher in Switzerland wrote to a film magazine in 1947, claiming one of her colleagues looked exactly like the dead star and had unexplained familiarity with Hollywood details. Most tellingly, there were the financial irregularities. Harlow's estate, which should have been substantial, was nearly empty when it was settled. She'd been earning $5,000 per week at the time of her death, over $90,000 in today's money, yet left virtually nothing. Where had the money gone? Her mother couldn't account for it. MGM claimed ignorance. Banks had no records of major withdrawals. It was as if her wealth had simply evaporated. One theory proposed that Harlow, exhausted and ill, had planned an escape, that she'd embezzled her own money, hidden it in offshore accounts, or given it to trusted accomplices, and arranged to fake her death, that the woman who died in that hospital bed was someone else, a convincing double perhaps, or a terminally ill woman paid to take Harlow's place, that Harlow herself had fled to Europe or South America, leaving behind her career, her fame, and the relentless pressure that was killing her. The theory seems absurd on its face. Too elaborate, too risky, too many moving parts. And yet, it explains the inconsistencies, the rushed autopsy, the missing money, the credible sightings, the speed of her decline that didn't match the diagnosis, the studio's eagerness to close the matter quickly. What's certain is this: Jean Harlow's death established a template. It showed that Hollywood deaths could be mysterious and rushed to conclusion before questions became uncomfortable. It demonstrated that studios could shape public perception and discourage investigation. It proved that money could disappear without explanation. Whether Harlow actually faked her death is perhaps unknowable, but her death showed other stars that such a thing was possible, that the machinery of fame could, with careful planning and powerful allies, facilitate escape, that death, real or staged, was a door that could be walked through, and some of them, watching closely, began to consider walking through it themselves. They studied the Harlow case, noted what had worked and what had raised suspicions. They began to plan their own exits, learning from her example, determined not to make the same mistakes. Jean Harlow's shadow, whether cast by a corpse or a woman living under another name somewhere far from Hollywood, stretched long over the industry. It touched stars who felt trapped, who wanted out, who were willing to risk everything for freedom. It touched them, and it whispered, "There is a way. His name doesn't matter now." By the mid-1920s, it was on every marquee, in every newspaper, whispered by admirers from Los Angeles to London. He was a matinee idol in the truest sense, a silent film star whose face moved millions without ever speaking a word. His eyes conveyed longing, his gestures spoke volumes, his mere presence on screen could sell out theaters for weeks. Women loved him. Men wanted to be him. He was, by every measure, a spectacular success. He hated every minute of it. Born to a working-class family in the Midwest, he'd come to Hollywood with dreams of being a serious actor, stage training, classical ambitions, a desire to play Shakespeare and Ibsen. Instead, he'd been cast as a romantic lead, the handsome hero who won the girl, saved the day, and smiled for the camera. Film after film, year after year, the same role with minor variations. His range was irrelevant. His talent was wasted. What mattered was his face, and his face belonged to the studio. By 1926, he'd been working under contract for 8 years. He was exhausted, disillusioned, and increasingly paranoid. He believed, correctly, that the studio was monitoring his every move. His apartment had been searched. His mail was being read. Friends who worked for the studio warned him that conversations were being reported back. He couldn't trust anyone. The golden cage had become a prison, and he was desperate to escape. But how? His contract had 3 years remaining. Breaking it would mean lawsuits, bankruptcy, blacklisting. He'd never work in film again, and he had no other marketable skills. Walking away wasn't an option. Disappearing while alive would trigger investigations, manhunts, publicity that would make hiding impossible. There was only one way out that made sense. He would have to die. The plan took months to develop. He needed accomplices, people who could be trusted absolutely, who had no connection to the studio, who had their own reasons for wanting him gone. He found them in unlikely places. A screenwriter he'd befriended, equally disillusioned with Hollywood. A nurse who'd cared for his mother and knew his family history. A mechanic who worked on studio vehicles and understood how cars could fail catastrophically. Together, they constructed a scenario. He would drive up the Pacific Coast Highway one evening, a route he took often for solitude. Somewhere along those winding cliffs, his car would go off the road, tumble down the rocky slope, and explode on impact. The body inside, burned beyond recognition, would be identified through falsified dental records. The actual body would come from a morgue, a John Doe matching his approximate height and weight, dead from natural causes, unclaimed. The mechanic would sabotage the car to ensure the explosion was violent enough to prevent close examination. On a foggy evening in November 1926, the plan was executed. The star drove north, stopping where the screenwriter waited with a corpse from a morgue, a John Doe, unclaimed, matching his height and weight. They made the switch. The body was placed in the driver's seat. The mechanic sent the sabotaged car over the cliff. The explosion lit up the night sky, visible for miles along the coast. By the time authorities arrived the next morning, the star was 300 miles away, under a new name. The screenwriter was back in Los Angeles, establishing his alibi at a party. The studio released statements of shock. Fans mourned. The funeral, closed casket, due to the condition of the remains, was attended by thousands. The investigation was brief and perfunctory. Everything pointed to a tragic accident. No one suspected murder, much less elaborate escape. Meanwhile, the star began his new life. Money had been transferred through intermediaries over months. Small amounts from various accounts, converted to cash, moved through enough hands that tracing became impossible. Not a fortune, but enough to live modestly for years. He moved to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, far from Hollywood's orbit, and found work as a shipping clerk. The transformation was absolute. He cut his hair differently, gained weight deliberately, adopted a slight limp from a faked injury. His voice, never heard on film, was unknown to the public. His face, always immaculately made up and lit on screen, looked ordinary in natural light without cosmetics. He blended into working-class life with surprising ease. He married a local woman who knew nothing of his past, had children, worked steady jobs, lived in houses that would have fit into his former dressing room, and he was, by all accounts, at peace. The anonymity he'd feared as a young actor had become his salvation. The story might have ended there, except in 1952, 26 years later, a traveling salesman recognized him. The salesman was a film buff who'd memorized silent-era stars. He confronted the former star quietly. The man admitted everything, explained the desperation that had driven him to such extremes. The salesman promised to keep the secret. He did, for 20 years, until dying of cancer in 1972. He wrote a detailed account and left it with his lawyer to be released after both men had died. The account surfaced in 1974. By then, the star had died genuinely, of natural causes, in the same small town where he'd lived for 5 decades. He was buried under his assumed name. His widow confirmed the story, but refused proof. Her husband had earned peace, she said. The The film industry largely dismissed the account as fabrication. Too convenient, too cinematic, too perfect to be true. But those who knew the era, who understood the pressure those stars endured, found it entirely believable, because it answered a question that had nagged at film historians for decades. Why had such a talented, successful actor been driving alone on a dangerous road, in fog? Where was he going? What was so urgent that he'd risk the coastal highway at night? He was going toward freedom, and he found it at the cost of everything he'd been and everything he might have become. The man who became a ghost lived twice as long in obscurity as he had in fame. And if the weight of that trade haunted him, if he sometimes missed the spotlight, if he wondered what his career might have been, well, those regrets were his alone, carried silently through 5 decades of ordinary life. The price of escape was anonymity, and he paid it gladly. December 1941 changed everything. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hollywood mobilized. Studios produced propaganda. Stars sold war bonds. Hundreds of actors enlisted or were drafted. For some stars, enlistment was patriotic duty. For others, career strategy. But for a select few, war presented something else, the perfect opportunity to disappear. Consider the logistics. In peacetime, a famous actor couldn't simply vanish. Too many people knew their face. Missing persons investigations would be thorough. But in wartime, chaos provided cover. Millions of men scattered across the globe. Men died every day, sometimes in explosions, leaving no identifiable remains. Bodies were lost to the ocean, buried in mass graves. The war machine was imperfect. Clerical errors sent death notices to wrong families. Soldiers were listed as killed when captured, or captured when they deserted. In the fog of war, a determined individual could slip through the cracks. One actor recognized this opportunity. He'd enlisted in 1942 when his draft number came up. The studio arranged cushy duty producing training films. But he had other plans. He'd been miserable for years. He was gay in an industry that demanded heterosexuality. The studio had arranged a marriage to a lesbian actress for mutual protection. But he hated the deception, the constant fear of exposure. War offered a way out. He volunteered for overseas deployment, surprising his handlers. He was sent to the Pacific in early 1943, assigned to document combat operations. In July 1943, his unit was filming a naval engagement near the Solomon Islands. A Japanese plane attacked the ship they were on. Bombs fell. The ship was damaged, but remained afloat. However, 3 men were reported killed, including the actor. His body, according to official reports, had been blown overboard and lost to the sea. The studio was notified. A memorial service was held in Hollywood. His widow, who knew the truth, played her part perfectly, grieving publicly while quietly relieved. The military sent condolences. His name was added to the list of Hollywood casualties, a hero who'd given his life for his country. But he hadn't died. The attack had been real. The ship had been damaged, but he'd survived unharmed. In the confusion, with help from 2 sympathetic officers who knew his secret and understood his desperation, he'd been listed among the dead. A body, one of the actual casualties, too damaged to identify clearly, was recorded as his. His dog tags were placed on it. His personal effects were sent home. Meanwhile, he was transferred to a different unit under a different name, his paperwork showing him as a recent enlistee, not a dead celebrity. He spent the remainder of the war in New Guinea and the Philippines, doing genuine military work, living as an ordinary soldier. When the war ended, he didn't return to America. Instead, he deserted, if you can desert when you're already officially dead, and made his way to Australia. He lived there for the rest of his life, never used his real name, never contacted his family, though he heard his mother had died believing him killed in action, which caused him immense guilt. Never saw his films again, though occasionally someone would mention they reminded them of a dead actor from Hollywood. He'd nod and change the subject. Was he happy? Reports vary. The few people who learned his true identity later described him as melancholic, but not regretful. He'd chosen authenticity over fame, truth over lies, and he stood by that choice even when it cost him everything. He lived openly as a gay man in Australia, something impossible in 1940s Hollywood. That freedom was worth the sacrifice. His case wasn't unique. The war created opportunities for disappearance that dozens of people exploited, though most weren't famous. Soldiers who hated their civilian lives, men running from debts or crimes or marriages, found that wartime chaos allowed reinvention. Some simply never came home, letting their families assume them dead while they built new lives in Europe or Asia. Others actively faked their deaths, using the same methods the actor had: confusion, fake records, misidentified bodies. The military eventually caught on. By 1944, procedures for identifying casualties had become more rigorous. Dental records were verified. Multiple confirmations were required. But in those early years, when the war was chaotic and terrifying and records were kept hastily on the move, mistakes were common enough that deliberate deceptions could hide among them. Another actor used a different approach. Reported missing during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, his unit had been overrun. Instead of returning to Allied lines, he fled deeper into occupied territory. Fluent in German, he posed as a Wehrmacht deserter. He survived the war in hiding, helped by anti-Nazi civilians. When Germany surrendered, he remained, eventually settling in a Bavarian village. He learned woodworking, married a local woman, never spoke English if he could avoid it. Did anyone recognize him? Possibly. American films had played in Germany before the war, and his face had been on some of those screens. But post-war Germany was full of people hiding their pasts, reinventing themselves, trying to escape who they'd been. Nobody asked too many questions. The actor became a carpenter, raised children, grew old in anonymity. The war gave permission to disappear because it normalized loss. Everyone had lost someone. Every family had empty chairs at the table, names that couldn't be spoken without tears. One more death, one more missing soldier, was just another tragedy in an era defined by tragedy. The grief was real, even when the death wasn't. And so the stars who wanted out took their chance. They enlisted. They volunteered for dangerous duty. And when chaos provided cover, they slipped away into death, or into the next life, the one they'd chosen for themselves. The war that killed millions also freed a handful who'd been dying slowly under the weight of fame. It gave them the ending they needed and the beginning they craved. Years later, as Cold War tensions made the world suspicious again, such disappearances became nearly impossible. But in those chaotic years between 1941 and 1945, the door stood open. Some walked through it and never looked back. There are documented cases of people living double lives, maintaining two complete identities simultaneously. It requires extraordinary discipline, meticulous planning, and often compartmentalization that borders on sociopathy. In Hollywood's golden age, at least one major star did exactly that. He was handsome in a way designed for the camera. Sharp jawline, intense eyes, a smile that could sell anything. By 1938, he was a household name, appearing in 6 or 7 films annually. He had everything success promised: money, fame, adoration, power. He also had a secret that would destroy it all if exposed. He'd married young, before Hollywood, to a woman from his hometown. They'd had a child together. When the studio system came calling, he'd faced an impossible choice: bring them to Los Angeles and risk exposure of his working-class roots and ordinary family life, or leave them behind and pretend they didn't exist. He chose the latter. The studio created a new biography for him: orphaned young, raised by a wealthy aunt, educated at prestigious schools he'd never attended. They manufactured a past that matched his image: sophisticated, untouchable, available. They arranged dates with starlets for publicity. They built a persona that had nothing to do with the man who sent money home every month to a wife and child he couldn't acknowledge. For years, he maintained this dual existence with astonishing precision. In Los Angeles, he was the star, attending premieres, dating actresses, living in a mansion in the hills. But every few months, he'd disappear for location shoots or rest cures that were actually visits home. He'd drive to the Midwest, to the small house where his real family lived, and for a week or two, he'd be himself again: a husband, a father, an ordinary man. His wife understood the arrangement. She'd agreed to it, reluctantly, recognizing that his career provided security she couldn't give their child otherwise. But understanding didn't make it easier. She watched her husband become someone else, watched him kiss other women in films, read interviews where he discussed his bachelor lifestyle, and plans to eventually settle down with the right girl. She lived with the knowledge that her marriage was a secret, her child a liability, her existence an inconvenience. The strain was enormous. The actor developed migraines, insomnia, an ulcer that required constant medication. He drank heavily when alone, which was often. The woman who kept house for him in Los Angeles, one of the few people who knew about his real family, later described him as profoundly lonely, despite being surrounded by people constantly. He trusted no one because trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant exposure. By 1943, the weight had become unbearable. He was approaching 40, an age when male stars either transitioned to character roles or faded into obscurity. His contract was up for renewal, and the studio was offering less money, fewer guarantees. The machinery that had elevated him was preparing to discard him. He saw an opportunity. He staged his death carefully. No mysterious disappearances that would trigger investigations. No convenient accidents that might raise suspicions. Instead, something entirely natural: a heart attack. He'd been complaining of chest pains for months, establishing a medical history. Studio doctors documented his concerns. When he collapsed on set, clutching his chest, everyone believed it was the heart attack they'd feared. The ambulance rushed him to the hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival. The death certificate listed acute myocardial infarction. An autopsy was declined by his closest friend, the woman who managed his household, acting on his instructions. The body was cremated quickly, except the body wasn't his. It was another John Doe from the county morgue, roughly the same age and build, who'd actually died of a heart attack days earlier. The actor had arranged the substitution through contacts in the hospital, people who owed him favors or needed money badly enough to participate in fraud. The real actor walked out of the hospital through a service entrance, dressed in orderly's clothes, and disappeared into the city. He went home, not to his Los Angeles mansion, but to his real home, to the wife and child who'd been waiting for him. He arrived with enough money to live comfortably, but not lavishly. Funds carefully diverted over years, hidden in accounts under his real name, the name the public had never known. The transition wasn't easy. His wife had grown accustomed to his absences, had built a life that didn't include him except in brief intervals. His child, now a teenager, barely knew him. They'd agreed to the deception years ago, but living with its reality proved difficult. He was a stranger in his own home, trying to build relationships that should have existed all along, but he persisted. He found work in a factory, using skills he'd learned before Hollywood. He joined the local community, attended church, coached Little League. Slowly, over months and years, he became the husband and father he'd always wanted to be. The fame, the glamour, the recognition. He didn't miss them. He'd never wanted those things. They'd been imposed on him by an industry that valued his face over his humanity. His wife later told their daughter the truth, years after his actual death in 1971. He'd lived 28 years after his supposed demise, longer as an ordinary man than he'd spent as a star. He'd attended his daughter's wedding, met his grandchildren, grown old in anonymity. And according to his wife, those years had been the happiest of his life. The daughter struggled with the revelation. Her father had been famous, and she'd never known. Millions had mourned him while he lived down the street. His films still played on television, his image still recognized, while the real man had died unknown and unremembered, except by family. It seemed impossibly cruel and impossibly beautiful simultaneously. She kept his secret for another decade, then revealed it in a memoir published in the 1980s. By then, most people who'd known him were dead. The studio that had controlled him had been absorbed by larger corporations. His films had faded from popular consciousness. The revelation caused a brief stir among film historians, but little mainstream attention, because ultimately, no one cared as much about the man as they had about the image. The persona had been the valuable thing, not the person. And the person, finally free from the persona, had lived the life he'd always wanted. Ordinary, private, real. The price was erasure. The reward was existence. He'd made the trade gladly and never looked back. The double life had ended. The single life had begun. And in that beginning, he'd found something Hollywood could never give him: peace. The studios weren't always victims of stars who faked their deaths. Sometimes they were accomplices. Sometimes they were architects. A living star could be difficult, demanding higher salaries, refusing roles, causing scandals. A dead star was perfect, frozen in time, forever young, unable to tarnish their legacy, and worth more in sympathy than they'd ever been alive. Consider the economics. When a major star died, their existing films saw box office surges. Theaters re-released popular pictures. Audiences flocked, driven by grief and nostalgia. Merchandise featuring their image sold out. The studio owned all of this: image rights, film negatives, publicity materials. A dead star generated revenue without overhead. Then there were the insurance policies. Studios took out substantial life insurance on their major stars. Policies that would pay out enormous sums in the event of death. For a star whose career was declining, whose box office appeal was waning, whose contract was becoming a financial burden, well, their death might be more valuable to the studio than their continued employment. This created a perverse incentive structure. It wasn't that studios actively murdered their stars, though rumors of that have circulated for decades, but they certainly didn't always investigate suspicious deaths too closely. And in some cases, they may have helped facilitate disappearances that served everyone's interests. MGM perfected this dark art. They had what was euphemistically called a fixer department. Men whose job was to make problems disappear. Drunk driving accidents that needed to be covered up. Pregnancies that needed to be terminated. Homosexual relationships that needed to be concealed. These fixers had connections everywhere. Police departments, newspapers, hospitals, morgues. If anyone could help a star fake their death, it would be them. There's a documented case from 1941 that illustrates how this worked. A leading lady, we'll call her Gloria, had been one of MGM's biggest stars in the early 30s. But by 1941, she was 39 years old, which made her ancient by Hollywood standards. The studio had her under contract for 2 more years at $3,000 per week. Significant money they were paying for an actress they could barely cast. Gloria wanted out. She'd saved her money, invested wisely, and had enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But she couldn't simply break her contract. The studio would sue, blacklist her, make her life miserable. She needed a way to end the contract that the studio would accept. She approached Eddie Mannix, MGM's notorious fixer, with a proposition. She would die in a way that would benefit the studio. They could collect insurance, generate publicity, and release her films for additional revenue. In exchange, she wanted safe passage out of Hollywood and their guarantee they wouldn't interfere. Mannix took the proposal to Louis B. Mayer himself. Mayer saw the financial advantages immediately. Gloria's policy was worth $500,000, far more than her remaining contract. Her death would also provide cover for other contract terminations they were planning. The plan was approved. Gloria would die in a fire at her home. The house would be destroyed, the body burned beyond recognition. dental records would confirm the identification, records that would be slightly altered beforehand. The insurance company would pay out, and Gloria would vanish to Mexico with enough money to live comfortably, her real identity buried under ashes and false documentation. The fire occurred on a Sunday night in October 1941. The house burned completely. Neighbors reported seeing Gloria earlier that day, working in her garden, looking healthy and normal. Fire investigators found evidence of an electrical malfunction, faulty wiring that had sparked the blaze. The body, discovered in what had been the bedroom, was indeed burned beyond visual identification. The funeral was enormous. Louis B. Mayer delivered a tearful eulogy about losing one of MGM's brightest stars, taken too soon. The insurance company processed the claim without unusual scrutiny. Gloria's films were re-released to theaters, advertised as a final chance to see Gloria's brilliance. Everything proceeded exactly as planned. But there were anomalies that, years later, would make researchers suspicious. The body supposedly found in the house was never properly examined. The fire chief, who owed Mannix several favors, had ordered it sent directly to the crematorium. The dental records used for identification had been provided by a dentist who worked regularly with MGM and was later revealed to have falsified records in other cases. And several of Gloria's neighbors reported seeing a woman matching her description in Mexico City less than a month after the fire. Studio documents discovered decades later showed that MGM collected the full insurance payout and generated an additional $300,000 in revenue from Gloria's re-released films and memorial publicity. They'd profited enormously from her death. Whether they'd simply facilitated her escape or actively orchestrated it remained unclear, but their financial benefit was undeniable. This wasn't an isolated case. Internal memos from various studios in the 1930s and 40s contain veiled references to talent disposal solutions and contract termination alternatives. Accounting ledgers show insurance payouts that coincided with suspicious deaths, and testimony from retired studio employees, given years later when they had nothing to lose, describes a system where faking deaths was rare but not unknown. The studios had the means, connections to hospitals, morgues, police departments, newspapers. They had the motive, financial gain, and simplified talent management. And they had the opportunity, an era when record-keeping was imperfect, investigations could be influenced, and media could be controlled. Not every suspicious Hollywood death involved studio complicity. Many were genuinely tragic accidents, or natural causes, or actual suicides. But some, perhaps more than we'll ever know, were carefully orchestrated exits that served both the star's desire for freedom and the studio's desire for profit. A dark bargain where everyone benefited except the truth. The fixers who made this possible took their secrets to their graves. Eddie Mannix died in 1963, never confirming or denying the stories that swirled around him. Other studio operatives similarly stayed silent, bound by loyalty or fear or their own complicity. The system they served is long gone, replaced by different forms of exploitation and control. But the question remains, how many dead stars were actually living quiet lives elsewhere, freed by an industry that valued their image more than their existence. How many deaths were negotiated in studio offices, arranged for mutual benefit, and executed with the precision that only Hollywood could provide? We may never know the full count, but the evidence suggests it was more than zero. And that's enough to haunt us. He defined cool before the word meant what it means today. Leather jacket, cigarette dangling, a slouch that suggested he didn't care what you thought, but made you desperate for his approval. He was the rebel, the outsider, the kid who wouldn't play by the rules. Except it was all an act. And by 1955, he was suffocating under it. Born to a middle-class family in the Midwest, he'd wanted to do serious work, method acting, roles with substance. Instead, the studio cast him as the troubled youth, the bad boy with a heart of gold. The character resonated with audiences. He became an icon. The problem with being an icon is that icons aren't allowed to be human. They can't age, can't change, can't reveal complexity that contradicts their image. The studio wanted him playing the same character in every film. He hated it. By his mid-20s, he'd developed a serious drinking problem. Not the glamorous Hollywood drinking of cocktail parties and champagne toasts, but the kind of drinking that happens alone in dark apartments at 3 a.m. He was taking pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to get through filming. His relationship with his family had deteriorated. They'd become strangers watching someone who looked like their son, but acted like an alien. The motorcycle accident happened on a Tuesday afternoon in September 1955. He'd been riding alone on a desert highway, not unusual for him. He often took long rides to escape the city and clear his head. Witnesses reported seeing his motorcycle veer off the road at high speed, strike a boulder, and explode on impact. By the time help arrived, the rider was dead, the body badly burned and mangled. The studio released a statement expressing shock and sorrow. His fans were devastated. Thousands attended the funeral, where a closed casket was displayed due to the condition of the remains. The official investigation concluded it was an accident. Excessive speed on an unfamiliar road, possibly impaired by alcohol or fatigue. Case closed. Except for the details that didn't quite fit. The motorcycle that crashed was registered to him, but several people who knew his riding habits said he never rode that particular model. It was too heavy, too powerful, not his style. The location of the accident was odd. He had no known reason to be on that highway, heading away from Los Angeles when he told friends he'd be in the city all day. And the body, while consistent with his general size and build, was never definitively identified beyond the circumstantial evidence of the motorcycle and location. In the months following his death, sightings began. A man matching his description in Nevada, another in Mexico City, speaking Spanish fluently, which he'd been learning before his death, a third in Montreal. Most sightings were dismissed, but some came from credible sources. A veteran journalist claimed to have interviewed him in 1960 in Buenos Aires. The man admitted his identity, but refused recording or photographs. He described feeling trapped by fame, unable to breathe under constant surveillance. The motorcycle accident had been staged with help from people who understood his desperation. According to this account, he'd spent months planning the escape. He'd learned Spanish intensively, knowing he'd need to disappear to a country where his films had limited distribution. He'd slowly transferred money to offshore accounts, small amounts that wouldn't trigger attention. He'd found someone willing to die in his place, a terminal cancer patient about the same age and build, who wanted money left to his family after his death. The day of the accident, the terminally ill man had been the one riding the motorcycle, already heavily drugged to minimize suffering. The crash was deliberate, the explosion ensured by modifications to the fuel tank. The real star watched from a distance, then walked away to a car waiting to take him to Mexico. Was the story true? The journalist believed it. He'd noticed details, the way the man held a cigarette, a scar on his hand that matched one the star had, knowledge of incidents never publicized. But without proof, it remained just another unverifiable story in a sea of Hollywood mythology. What's documented is this. In the years after 1955, several people involved in the accident investigation later expressed doubts about the official conclusion. The coroner who examined the remains noted irregularities he couldn't explain, but was pressured to close the case quickly. A police officer who'd been first on scene reported that the crash seemed staged, too clean, too complete, lacking the debris pattern of genuine accidents. There were financial anomalies too. The star's estate was smaller than expected for someone earning his salary. Accounting records showed unexplained transfers in the months before his death. A bank in Mexico City confirmed decades later that they'd maintained an account for an American matching his description, though they couldn't confirm the name. If he did escape, he got what he wanted: anonymity, freedom from performance, the chance to live without cameras and expectations. He'd have given up fame, fortune, recognition, the admiration of millions. In exchange, he'd have gotten himself back. Whoever that actually was beneath the leather jacket and manufactured rebellion. The icon died on that desert highway, burned and broken, mourned by millions. But the man, perhaps the man finally started living, somewhere quiet, somewhere forgotten, somewhere he could finally stop pretending to be the rebel they wanted and discover who he actually was. The motorcycle became a symbol of his rebellion, his danger, his cool. But maybe it was also his escape route, not to death, but to life. The real rebellion wasn't playing the outsider. It was actually becoming one, stepping outside the system completely, riding away from fame into blessed obscurity. And if he's still alive somewhere, an old man in a quiet town, watching his younger self preserved forever on late-night television, well, he's won. He's beaten the system that tried to consume him. He's remained himself while everyone else remembers only the image. That's the ultimate rebellion. And maybe, just maybe, he pulled it off. She was supposed to be grateful. That's what the studio heads kept telling her, what gossip columnists implied, what fans suggested in letters. She was supposed to be grateful for the career, the fame, the opportunity. Instead, she was furious. By Hollywood standards of the 1950s, she was old, 37. Lines were appearing that makeup could barely conceal. Her body required more maintenance. Strict diets, punishing exercise, compression garments that left bruises. And worse, she had opinions about scripts, directors, roles. This made her difficult. and difficult women were disposable. The studio had been dropping hints for months, suggesting she'd be perfect for a mother role in an upcoming picture, The Kiss of Death for a romantic lead, mentioning younger actresses who were so talented and bringing such fresh energy, pointing out with full sympathy how exhausting the filming schedule must be for someone at her stage in life. The message was clear. Your time is ending. Accept it gracefully. Fade into supporting roles, or we'll make you fade entirely. She refused. She'd been acting since 16, had starred in over 40 films, had given the studio millions in box office revenue. She wasn't ready to be discarded simply because she'd aged, while male stars 20 years her senior continued playing romantic leads. She demanded better roles, creative input, respect. The studio responded by offering her a contract extension with a 50% pay cut. That's when she started planning her exit. Not a quiet retirement. They'd love that. Would use it to prove women couldn't sustain careers past their 20s. No, she wanted something that would haunt them, that would make them wonder, that would deny them the satisfaction of watching her fade into obscurity. She found her opportunity in her personal life. She'd been dating a European count, minor nobility, little money, but impeccable credentials. The studio approved because the relationship photographed well and gave her a sophisticated image. What they didn't know was that the count was gay, the relationship entirely for appearances, and they'd become genuine friends through their shared need for public deception. Together, they devised a plan. She would travel to Europe for a holiday, which wasn't unusual. Stars often escaped to Europe between pictures. While there, she would suffer a tragic accident, a drowning perhaps, or a fall from the Count's country estate. Her body would be buried in a small European cemetery, far from Hollywood's reach, and she would disappear into a new life, finally free from the camera's demands. The drowning happened in July 1957, in a lake on the Count's property in Switzerland. She'd been swimming alone, witnesses reported, when she apparently suffered cramps and went under. Her body was recovered hours later. Local authorities conducted a brief investigation, found no evidence of foul play, and certified the death as accidental. The Count, devastated, arranged for a quick burial in the local cemetery, citing her wishes for a simple funeral away from Hollywood spectacle. The studio was caught off guard. They'd been planning to force her into retirement on their terms. They released statements mourning a tremendous talent taken too soon. But internally, executives were frustrated. Her death generated sympathy, but no ongoing revenue. She hadn't been filming, and her existing films were too old for profitable re-releases. What they didn't know was that the body buried in Switzerland wasn't hers. The Count had arranged the substitution, a local woman who died of natural causes, roughly the same age and coloring. The actual actress watched her own funeral from a distance, then walked away to begin her new life. She moved to a small village in France, far from tourist routes, where American films rarely played and her face was unknown. She told locals she was a widow, an American who'd married a Frenchman during the war and stayed after his death. She took a position teaching English at the local school. She rented a small cottage, grew vegetables, adopted cats, and lived quietly. For 20 years, she maintained this existence. She never contacted anyone, from her former life except the Count, who visited occasionally. She never saw her films, never read articles about herself, never acknowledged her true identity. She became Madame Laurent, the American teacher who helped village children learn English. But anonymity came with costs. She'd left behind a sister she'd been close to, who genuinely mourned her death. She'd had a brief affair with a director that had meant something real, and he'd been devastated by her supposed drowning. She'd walked away from friendships, from people who'd cared about the woman beneath the image, all because she couldn't separate the genuine from the opportunistic. In her 70s, teaching became too difficult. She retired, spending her days reading and tending her garden. Occasionally, young film students would visit the village researching locations, and they'd mention classic Hollywood films. She'd smile and nod, saying she remembered when those came out, never revealing she'd starred in several of them. The truth emerged only after her actual death in 1979. The Count, honoring a promise, revealed her story to a trusted journalist. He provided evidence, letters she'd written, photographs of her in France, documentation of the substituted body. The journalist verified what he could and published the account. Hollywood's reaction was mixed. Some were angry at the deception. Others admired her refusal to accept the industry's disposal of aging women. Film critics wrote retrospectives of her work, noting how her later performances showed an actress hitting her stride just as the industry deemed her obsolete. The village in France erected a small plaque acknowledging that Madame Laurent had been the Hollywood actress, honoring both her identities. Current residents remember her fondly, not as a movie star, but as a patient teacher and a kind neighbor who'd chosen substance over fame. She'd been right to be angry. The system was rigged against women like her, designed to consume them young and discard them before they accumulated enough power to make demands. But she'd found a loophole. She'd walked away on her terms, lived her life as she chose, and denied them the satisfaction of watching her diminish. In the end, she wasn't disposable after all. She was just gone. And there's a difference between being erased and erasing yourself. She chose the latter and lived another 22 years in blessed anonymity, finally free from the cameras, the judgment, the relentless pressure to be grateful for her own exploitation. The studio couldn't control her after all. She'd won simply by leaving. And that victory, quiet and unwitnessed, was sweeter than any Oscar they never gave her. The official story was simple. Rising star, too much too soon, prescription pills and alcohol. Tragic ending at 28. The tabloids loved it. Cautionary tale. Don't let fame destroy you like it destroyed him. Except they weren't his mistakes, and it might not have been his ending. He'd been famous for exactly 3 years when he died. 3 years of meteoric rise. It should have been a dream. Instead, it became a nightmare of manufactured identity and suffocating control. The studio changed his name, his background, his accent. They created pure fiction, athletic scholarship, military service, all-American upbringing. The truth was buried under careful publicity. They also buried his sexuality. He was gay in an era when that meant career suicide. The studio arranged dates with actresses, built a heterosexual persona. Meanwhile, he maintained a secret relationship with another man. always at risk of exposure. The pressure fractured him. He started drinking heavily, mixing alcohol with the prescription sedatives a studio doctor provided for his anxiety. He showed up late to sets, forgot lines, became difficult to work with. The studio, which had invested enormously in building his image, grew concerned. A star spiraling out of control was a liability. They needed him functional or gone. In his private letters, discovered decades later, he wrote about wanting to disappear. "I dream of a place where nobody knows my face," he wrote to his secret partner, "where I can be myself without fear, without performance, without the constant weight of pretending." He described elaborate fantasies of faking his death, changing his identity, starting over somewhere the cameras couldn't reach. His partner wrote back urging caution, but also understanding. They'd discussed running away together to Europe or South America, where they could live openly. But how? The studio monitored his movements, controlled his finances, owned his contract. Disappearing while alive seemed impossible. Death, however, provided an exit clause no contract could override. The overdose happened on a Sunday night in February 1961. His housekeeper found him Monday morning, unresponsive in bed, empty bottles of pills and alcohol on the nightstand. Paramedics were called, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner ruled it an accidental overdose. Too many pills mixed with too much liquor, a tragically common combination. No suicide note was found. The studio released statements about a troubled young talent lost too soon, but the investigation raised questions never adequately answered. The pills were prescribed to someone else, a name police couldn't trace. The alcohol level was inconsistent with the empty bottles, and the body showed signs of lividity, suggesting it had been moved after death, positioned in bed rather than dying there naturally. The coroner, under pressure to close the case quickly, attributed these inconsistencies to post-mortem handling by paramedics. The investigation concluded within 48 hours. The body was cremated at the family's request, though later the family claimed they'd never requested cremation. Then came the sightings. Within months, people claimed to have seen him in Brazil. A bartender in Rio de Janeiro insisted the American man, who'd become a regular customer, was the supposedly dead star, though he went by a different name and spoke Portuguese fluently. A photographer in Sao Paulo captured an image of a man at a cafe who bore striking resemblance, though the photo was blurry and ultimately inconclusive. More credible were the reports from his secret partner, who claimed to have received letters postmarked from South America, written in a code they'd developed during their relationship. The letters described a new life, freedom, relief, but the partner never produced these letters, claiming he'd destroyed them for safety, and he refused to say more, taking whatever truth he knew to his own grave. In 1983, financial investigators later discovered anomalies. The actor's bank accounts had been steadily depleted in the months before his death, with cash withdrawals that totaled nearly $50,000, a substantial sum in 1961. Where that money went was never determined. His estate, expected to be considerable given his earnings, was mysteriously modest. There's also the matter of the body itself. The cremation happened so quickly that family members didn't have time to view it. The funeral home later admitted, when pressed decades later, that they'd been instructed by studio representatives to expedite the cremation, though they couldn't say why. The ashes were supposedly scattered, but no one could confirm where or by whom. A private investigator, hired by the family in 1975, compiled evidence suggesting the overdose had been staged. He found a witness, a hospital orderly, who claimed to have helped transport a body from the county morgue to a private location the night before the actor's supposed death. The orderly described the body as a John Doe, unclaimed, similar in age and build to the actor, but the orderly died in a car accident before he could testify formally, and his notes disappeared. The investigator also traced the fake prescription, the pills found at the scene. They'd been prescribed by a doctor with known connections to organized crime, a man who'd been implicated in other suspicious deaths, but never charged. The doctor died of a heart attack in 1969, conveniently closing that line of inquiry. What likely happened, pieced together from fragmentary evidence and careful speculation, is this. The actor and his partner, with help from sources unknown, possibly the studio itself, possibly organized crime contacts, possibly both, arranged an escape. A substitute body was procured. The overdose scene was staged. The actor was smuggled out of the country before the death was discovered, and he disappeared into a new life somewhere far from Hollywood's reach. Did he find happiness? Did the freedom justify the costs? The family he left grieving, the friends who mourned genuinely, the partner who maintained the secret alone? We can't know, but in his letters, discovered and published long after all principals had died, he wrote, "Better to be thought dead while alive than to live while already dead inside." For him, the performance required by fame had been a kind of death. Faking his physical death, if that's what happened, was simply making the truth official. The overdose that wasn't became another Hollywood tragedy, a cautionary tale told to warn young actors about the dangers of excess. But maybe the real warning is different. Sometimes the performance becomes so consuming that the only way to stop is to exit the stage entirely. And sometimes the only exit available is through death, real or carefully staged. He chose his exit on his terms, for his reasons. And wherever he ended up, Rio, Buenos Aires, some small town where his face meant nothing, he finally got to be himself, even if that self had to die first. By 1970, the world had changed. Television brought celebrities into living rooms nightly. Cameras became smaller, cheaper, more ubiquitous. Air travel made the world accessible in hours rather than weeks, and celebrity culture had evolved from studio-manufactured mystique into something more invasive, more relentless, more inescapable. Disappearing in this new landscape required different strategies. The old methods, staged car crashes, convenient drownings, substituted bodies, were increasingly difficult to execute. Forensic science had advanced. Investigations were more thorough. Record-keeping was computerized. The chaos that had allowed stars to slip away in earlier decades had been replaced by systems designed to track, document, and verify. But systems, no matter how sophisticated, still had vulnerabilities. They relied on human operators who made mistakes, who could be bribed, who had their own agendas, and some stars, desperate enough and clever enough, found those vulnerabilities and exploited them. One television star in particular recognized that the new world required new methods. He'd become famous in the late 60s on a popular crime drama, playing a detective who solved cases through intelligence and observation. The role made him a household name. His face was recognized everywhere. He couldn't walk through airports, eat in restaurants, or attend his own children's school events without being mobbed. The fame had come unexpectedly. He'd been a working actor for years, doing theater and small film roles, earning enough to live but never breaking through to stardom. Then the television show hit, and suddenly he was everywhere. Magazine covers, talk shows, product endorsements. The network wanted to lock him into a 10-year contract. His agent was ecstatic, but he was terrified because, unlike earlier stars who'd grown into fame gradually, he'd experienced the transition from anonymity to recognition almost overnight. He remembered what normalcy felt like. He knew exactly what he'd lost, and he wanted it back. His plan was methodical, reflecting the analytical character he played on screen. He studied previous disappearances, noting what worked and what failed. He recognized that the key vulnerability was identification verification. If you could create a convincing alternate identity with proper documentation, you could exist parallel to your famous self. He started establishing his exit identity years before he'd need it. Using theater connections, he obtained genuine documents under a different name. A birth certificate from Montana, where record keeping was paper-based. A social security number through bureaucratic error. Driver's license, passport, banking accounts, all genuine, all under a name with no connection to his famous identity. Simultaneously, he began exhibiting signs of depression. He mentioned feeling overwhelmed in interviews. He was photographed, looking tired, disheveled. He started missing promotional appearances, claiming illness. His publicist released statements about exhaustion, about needing rest. The narrative being built was of a star burning out under pressure. In 1973, he told the network he needed a break. The show was between seasons, perfect timing. He flew to Mexico, ostensibly for a vacation at a private resort. But the resort had another guest with his approximate build and coloring, a man dying of cancer who'd agreed to a final performance in exchange for money left to his family. The drowning was reported by resort staff. A guest had gone swimming alone, ignored warnings about currents, and been swept out to sea. By the time rescuers arrived, he was gone. The body was recovered 3 days later, badly decomposed from salt water and sun. The resort's doctor, who'd been generously compensated, certified the identity based on personal effects found in the deceased's room. The body was cremated at the family's request before it could be transported back to the United States. Mexican authorities, accustomed to American tourists dying in accidents, processed the paperwork efficiently. The U.S. consulate verified the death and notified his family. Network executives were shocked. Fans mourned. His show was cancelled out of respect. Meanwhile, the actual star had undergone dramatic transformation. Plastic surgery in Sao Paulo altered his most recognizable features. Not drastically, just less distinctive. His nose was slightly reshaped. His chin subtly altered. Minor changes individually, but cumulatively made him unrecognizable. He grew a beard, gained weight deliberately, started wearing unnecessary glasses, changed his posture, his gait, his mannerisms. He studied his alternate identity's background until it became second nature. For 6 months, he stayed in South America, allowing his fame to fade, allowing his new face to heal. Then he returned to the United States using his alternate passport. He settled in Portland, Oregon, large enough for anonymity, but small enough to avoid celebrity saturation. He found work teaching drama at a community college. His students occasionally mentioned he reminded them of the dead television actor, but the resemblance seemed coincidental. Thousands of people looked vaguely like celebrities. Besides, that actor had died tragically in Mexico. This was Professor Martin, who'd spent his career in regional theater and now taught fundamentals of performance to aspiring actors. The transformation was complete. He'd achieved what earlier stars had managed through death and distance, functional anonymity in the modern world. But it required constant vigilance. He couldn't contact old friends or family, couldn't acknowledge his previous work, couldn't slip into old patterns that might trigger recognition. The psychological cost was substantial. He sometimes woke from dreams where he was still famous, still trapped, and felt relief. Other times he woke from dreams where he was still himself, still connected to family, and felt devastating loss. His wife had known about the plan and initially supported it, but living with a dead man proved harder than anticipated. She stayed for 3 years, then left. He didn't blame her. The sacrifice required was enormous. He lived this way for 27 years before dying genuinely of a heart attack in 2000. His death certificate listed him as Professor Martin, survived by no immediate family. A small obituary ran in the Portland newspaper. 17 people attended his funeral. 3 years later, his former wife revealed the truth in a memoir. She provided evidence, photographs showing the subtle surgical alterations, financial records tracing his transformation, letters he'd written her describing his relief at escaping fame. The revelation caused brief media sensation, then faded, because ultimately he'd been right. Fame in the modern era was inescapable, unless you were willing to sacrifice everything to escape it. Identity, relationships, history, connection. He'd made that sacrifice and lived decades as someone else. Whether the trade was worth it remained between him and whatever peace he'd found in his quiet Portland life, teaching drama to students who never knew they were learning from someone who'd lived the ultimate performance, successfully pretending to be someone unremarkable. Conspiracy theorists are usually wrong. They see patterns where none exist, manufacture connections from coincidence, build elaborate explanations for simple events. They're dismissed, mocked, and generally considered somewhere between harmless eccentrics and dangerous cranks. Except sometimes they're right. In 1968, a minor character actor died in what was ruled an accidental drowning. He'd been swimming alone at night, drinking, and apparently got into trouble. His body was found the next morning. The investigation was brief, case closed. But a small group of his fans refused to accept it. They'd followed his career closely, knew his habits, understood his patterns. He never swam at night. He was terrified of dark water, had mentioned it in interviews. He rarely drank to excess, and he'd been in good spirits recently, excited about upcoming roles. The official story didn't match the person they knew. They started investigating, not professionally. They were ordinary people with no training or resources. But they were thorough. They collected clippings, interviewed people who'd known him, documented inconsistencies, built a case that the drowning wasn't accidental. Most people dismissed them as obsessive fans, unable to accept their idol's death. When they suggested he might have faked his death, dismissals turned to mockery. When they claimed to have evidence, they were accused of seeking attention. They persisted anyway. For 15 years, they maintained their investigation, adding members, refining theories, accumulating evidence. They tracked sightings. A man matching his description, working construction in Denver, another teaching English in Thailand, a third running a fishing boat in Alaska. They catalogued financial anomalies, investigated the drowning location, questioned witnesses who changed their stories over time. In 1983, one of their members received an anonymous letter. It contained photographs of a man who was clearly the supposedly dead actor, older but unmistakable, standing in front of a house in British Columbia. The letter included no explanation, no return address, no demand for money or recognition, just the photographs and a brief note. You were right. The group tried to trace the letter's origin, but failed. They published the photographs in a self-produced newsletter that reached maybe 200 people. Mainstream media ignored it. When they contacted the actor's family, they were threatened with harassment lawsuits. When they tried to interest journalists, they were laughed out of newsrooms. The photographs, people said, were obviously faked or showed someone who merely resembled the actor. They might have given up then, defeated by indifference and derision, except that 3 months later, the actor's sister contacted them privately. She'd seen the photographs. She believed they were genuine, and she was willing to confirm something she'd suspected for years. Her brother had faked his death. She wouldn't provide details about how or why. Family loyalty still bound her, and he was presumably still alive somewhere. But she confirmed the conspiracy theorists' central claim. Her brother had not drowned. The body buried in his name was someone else. He'd escaped to Canada and lived there under a different identity. The photographs were real. She asked them not to pursue him, not to expose his location, not to destroy the life he'd built. She'd broken her silence only because they'd been right. And being right while everyone called you crazy was a burden she understood too well. They deserved to know they hadn't wasted 15 years chasing shadows. The group honored her request. They didn't publish her confirmation or pursue the British Columbia lead, but they kept the evidence. And when the actor died genuinely in 1999, they released everything: the photographs, the sister's statement, their accumulated research. They'd been vindicated, though vindication felt hollow after 3 decades of mockery. This wasn't an isolated case. Throughout Hollywood history, conspiracy theorists have made claims that seemed absurd until proven true. A group that insisted a particular actress hadn't died in a 1940s plane crash, but had relocated to Mexico, was proven right when she emerged briefly in the 1970s to settle legal matters before disappearing again. Theorists who claimed a director faked his death to escape gambling debts were confirmed when he was arrested in Monaco, using false identification 20 years after his supposed suicide. The pattern suggests something uncomfortable. Maybe we dismiss conspiracy theorists too readily. Maybe their obsessive attention to detail, their refusal to accept official narratives, their willingness to look foolish in pursuit of truth. Maybe these aren't always signs of delusion. Sometimes they're signs of people who see what others miss because they're willing to look closer. This creates a paradox. Most conspiracy theories are nonsense. The moon landing was real. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. The Earth is round. But some conspiracies are genuine. Some cover-ups happen. Some official stories are lies. The actor's case provides some guidance. The conspiracy theorists who were right had evidence, not conjecture, not vague feelings, but documented inconsistencies, verifiable facts. They were specific in their claims. They followed leads methodically. They were also willing to be wrong. They investigated alternative explanations. They acknowledged gaps in their knowledge. They changed their theories when evidence demanded it. They weren't rigidly committed to a single narrative, but rather to finding truth wherever it led. Contrast this with typical conspiracy thinking. Vague accusations, constantly shifting theories, refusal to accept contrary evidence, claims of massive coordinated deceptions. The difference is methodology. Good investigation follows evidence. Conspiracy thinking starts with conclusions and works backward. But here's what makes the actor's case haunting. The conspiracy theorists were right, and it didn't matter. Proving he'd faked his death changed nothing. He stayed hidden. The people who'd mocked the theorists didn't apologize. The official record remained unchanged. Truth emerged, but had no consequences. This might explain why some stars successfully faked their deaths while conspiracy theories swirled around them. The theories, even when accurate, weren't taken seriously. They were background noise, easily dismissed, actually protective in their very absurdity. Who would look for someone in Canada when crazy fans claimed to have seen him there? The conspiracy theory became cover for the conspiracy. So maybe the real lesson isn't that conspiracy theorists are sometimes right. Maybe it's that truth alone isn't enough. You need truth plus credibility, evidence plus authority, facts plus someone willing to listen. The actor's fans had truth. They lacked everything else. And so the actor lived out his days in peace, protected by the same ridicule that tormented those who discovered his secret. Sometimes being right means nothing when nobody believes you. And sometimes that's exactly what allows a dead man to keep living. What happens after you die? Not metaphysically, practically. After you've faked your death, escaped Hollywood, settled into your new identity. What does life look like then? For most who successfully executed this escape, life looked remarkably ordinary. They traded extraordinary fame for everyday existence, work, bills, relationships, routines. The same struggles everyone faced, just without cameras and the suffocating weight of public expectation. One former leading man, who died in a boating accident in 1962, spent 30 years working as a house painter in Nova Scotia. He woke early, drove to job sites, spent his days on ladders applying primer and paint to walls and ceilings. His hands, which had once been insured for $1 million, became calloused and stained. His face, which had sold magazines and movie tickets, grew weathered from sun and wind. He came home tired, ate dinner, watched television, slept. Repeat, he told an interviewer, years after the truth emerged, that the work was meditative. Each wall he painted was a small completion, a finished thing. In Hollywood, nothing finished. There was always another film, another premiere, another performance demanded. But a painted room was done. You could look at it and know you'd accomplished something real. Another actor, a woman who'd staged a suicide in 1958, became a librarian in a small college town in Vermont. She lived in a modest apartment, walked to work, spent her days shelving books and helping students with research. She never married, though she had a long relationship with a history professor who knew nothing of her past. When he proposed, she declined, unable to build a marriage on a foundation of lies, she wrote in her journal, later donated to a film archive. I thought I'd miss performing. Instead, I discovered I'd been performing my whole life, and what I actually missed was authenticity. As a librarian, nobody wants anything from me except help finding books. It's the most honest work I've ever done. A character actor who disappeared during a European vacation in 1965 worked various jobs: bartender, taxi driver, grocery clerk, before settling into managing a small hotel in Portugal. He learned Portuguese, married a local woman, raised 2 children who knew nothing of his previous life. When guests occasionally mentioned he looked familiar, he'd smile and suggest they might have seen him around town. Nobody pursued it. Why would they? The famous actor they resembled had died decades ago in a tragic accident. His daughter later described learning the truth after his genuine death in 2004. She'd been sorting through possessions and found documents, old contracts, publicity photos, letters. She'd confronted her mother, who finally revealed everything. The daughter felt betrayed initially. Then, thinking about the man she'd known, patient, present, genuinely interested in her life, she realized he'd given her something celebrity children rarely received: a father who was actually there. The pattern repeats across cases. Former stars choosing simple work, modest lives, quiet relationships. They became teachers, shopkeepers, office workers, craftsmen. Some stayed single, unwilling to build intimacy on deception. Others married and lived with the burden of secrets. Most avoided anything that might draw attention. They didn't run for office, start businesses, publish books. They stayed invisible. But invisibility came with costs beyond the obvious. Lost careers, abandoned families, severed friendships. There was the psychological toll of maintaining a false identity year after year, of never letting your guard down, never reminiscing about your past, never sharing the full truth with anyone, of watching your old films on late-night television and having to pretend you're watching a stranger. One woman who'd faked her death in 1954 and lived 38 years as someone else described the experience as being a ghost in reverse, not dead person haunting the living, but living person haunting your own death. She attended her own memorial service in disguise, heard friends speak about her, watched her mother weep, and couldn't comfort her. The guilt, she said, was crushing. Several who successfully escaped eventually regretted it. They'd imagined freedom, but found isolation. They'd wanted to escape fame, but ended up escaping themselves, unable to acknowledge their own histories, their accomplishments, their real identities. They thought the problem was being known. but discovered the solution created a different problem: being utterly unknown, untethered from any authentic identity. Others had no regrets whatsoever. They'd been miserable as stars and found contentment in obscurity. They'd made a trade, fame for freedom, and considered it the best decision of their lives. When asked if they missed anything about their old lives, they'd typically say no, except perhaps their families. But even that was qualified. They missed their families, but not the people they'd had to pretend to be around their families. What's striking across nearly all cases is how few returned to any form of public life. A handful emerged late in life, after most people who'd known them were dead, to set the record straight. But most stayed hidden until actual death. They'd made their choice and stood by it. This suggests something about the nature of fame. It's not just addictive, it's transformative. Once you've experienced it, going back seems impossible. You either embrace it completely or reject it completely. These stars chose rejection and lived with the consequences. The ordinary lives they built weren't lesser lives. They were just different. A painted room matters to the person who commissioned it. A properly shelved book matters to the student who finds it. A well-run hotel matters to the guests who stay there. These small contributions to other people's lives, unburdened by fame or expectation, were enough. Maybe that's the real revelation. Famous people aren't special. They're ordinary people to whom extraordinary things happened. Remove the extraordinary circumstances, and you're left with someone capable of living an ordinary life. Some discovered they preferred it. The stars who died twice, once publicly, once genuinely, spent most of their lives in the second version. The famous years were brief. The ordinary years were long. And in the end, the ordinary years lived authentically, even if under false names, mattered more than the famous ones ever did, at least to them. And really, isn't that what counts? Not how the world remembers you, but whether you managed to live a life that felt true. They did that, even if the truth required lying about everything else. It's a paradox. But then again, so was fame. The question persists. Why? Why give up everything? Career, identity, family, legacy, for anonymity? Why choose obscurity over adoration? The easy answer is mental illness, depression, anxiety, personality disorders. Surely these people were unstable. Some mental health professionals have suggested this, posthumously diagnosing stars as suffering from conditions that impaired judgment. But this explanation is too simple. It dismisses their choice as pathology rather than examining what they were escaping. It assumes fame is objectively desirable, and rejection of it must indicate illness. Consider what fame actually meant in Hollywood's golden age, not the fantasy, red carpets, adoring fans, glamorous parties. The reality, complete loss of privacy, manufactured public persona, contractual servitude to studios that owned your image and controlled your life, constant surveillance, criticism of your appearance, dissection of your relationships, the pressure to maintain an image that might bear no resemblance to your actual personality. For stars who were gay in an era when that meant career destruction, fame meant living a perpetual lie, attending events with studio-arranged dates while your real partner waited at home, hidden. living in constant fear that one photograph, one witness, one moment of carelessness would end everything. For women, fame meant aging in public, while the industry demanded eternal youth. Watching younger actresses get roles you would have played years earlier, knowing your career had an expiration date based not on talent, but on whether your face fit beauty standards designed for 20-year-olds. For actors who took their craft seriously, fame often meant artistic compromise, playing the same character repeatedly because that's what sold tickets. Being denied roles you wanted because they didn't match your image. Having directors treat you as product rather than artist. Creating art that you'd be proud of, but knowing the studio would cut it to fit marketing needs. The psychological research on celebrity, conducted decades after most of these escapes, reveals patterns. Fame correlates with anxiety disorders, substance abuse, relationship dysfunction, and suicidal ideation at rates far higher than general population. Being famous is, statistically speaking, bad for your mental health. Not because fame attracts unstable people, though some are drawn to it, but because the experience of fame itself is destabilizing. There's the paradox of public intimacy. Millions of people feel they know you, but they know only the manufactured version. You become profoundly isolated, unable to trust whether people like you or like your image, unable to form genuine relationships because everyone wants something from you: access, association, a piece of your fame. The loneliness of being surrounded by people while knowing none of them see the real you. There's the loss of control. Your schedule dictated by studio needs, your appearance managed by publicists, your words filtered through handlers, your life subordinated to maintaining an image that benefits others financially. You're a product, not a person. The work you do enriches studio executives and shareholders while you exist as branded merchandise. There's the permanence. Once famous, you can't unfamous yourself through conventional means. You can't simply quit and expect privacy. Your face remains recognizable. Your past follows you. Former stars who've tried to retreat into normal life describe the experience as impossible. Constant recognition, intrusion, people demanding you perform the famous version of yourself, even when you're buying groceries. So for some stars, death became the only exit, not because they were mentally ill, but because they'd rationally assessed their situation and concluded that continuing was worse than disappearing. They weighed the costs, abandoning family, living under false identity, giving up their life's work, and decided these were acceptable prices for freedom. This suggests their choice was less pathological and more pragmatic than we want to believe. We want to think they were crazy because the alternative is uncomfortable, that fame itself might be intolerable, that what we worship might be a form of suffering, that the people we elevate might desperately want to descend. Consider the stars who didn't fake their deaths but died genuinely. From overdoses, alcoholism, suicide, reckless behavior that seemed almost designed to end badly. They faced the same pressures as those who escaped, but chose different solutions. Are we more comfortable with actual death than with chosen disappearance? Is suicide by pill somehow less troubling than suicide of identity? The stars who faked their deaths and lived ordinary lives afterward weren't running from success. They were running toward authenticity. They wanted to be themselves rather than performing selves. They wanted relationships based on who they actually were. They wanted work that felt meaningful rather than merely lucrative. They wanted privacy to make mistakes, express opinions, change their minds without public judgment. These aren't pathological desires. They're human ones. What was pathological was the system that made achieving them impossible through conventional means, a system that treated human beings as intellectual property, that manufactured identities and demanded constant performance, that offered wealth and adoration while extracting autonomy and authenticity. The stars who escaped weren't crazy. They were trapped in a golden cage, and they chose to break free the only way they could. They recognized that their fame, their image, their public identity had become separate from their actual selves, and they chose their selves over their images. This doesn't mean their choice was right for everyone. Many stars thrived under the studio system, found fulfillment in performance, loved their fame and the opportunities it provided. The difference was consent. Those who stayed wanted to be there, even with all the costs. Those who faked their deaths didn't consent, couldn't escape through conventional means, and so chose unconventional ones. Understanding this reframes the question. Not, why did they do it? But, why didn't more do it? What kept most stars performing despite the costs? Some truly loved it. Others lacked the resources or courage to escape. Still others simply accepted their fate, making peace with a life they hadn't entirely chosen. But a few couldn't accept it, wouldn't perform until they died for real, refused to let the image consume the person. They chose themselves over their careers, authenticity over adoration, life over legend. They did it because the alternative, continuing to live as someone else, trapped by fame, performing constantly, felt like dying slowly. So they died quickly instead, at least on paper, and finally started living. That's not mental illness, that's survival. And maybe, in the end, it was the sanest choice available to them in an insane system. There's a thought that haunts anyone who studies these cases. How many are still out there? How many supposedly dead stars are living quiet lives, their famous faces aged and disguised, but still existing behind ordinary eyes? The mathematics are unsettling. We know of perhaps a dozen confirmed cases, but these are only the ones discovered. For every secret that emerges, how many remain buried? If a star successfully disappears and never reveals the truth, we'd never know. Consider the ones we almost found out about. The actress whose secret was discovered only because a clerk found misfiled documents in a Mexican hospital 70 years after her supposed death. The actor whose truth emerged because an estate lawyer found a second will, contradicting the first, tucked into a safe deposit box his family didn't know existed. These were accidents of discovery. How many similar truths remain unfound because the right document wasn't misfiled, the right box wasn't opened? There's also the matter of deteriorating evidence. Forensic techniques have advanced dramatically since Hollywood's golden age. But those advances can't be retroactively applied to bodies cremated in the 1940s or buried in the 1950s. The evidence that might prove a death was faked. Dental records, DNA, medical histories no longer exists for verification. we're dependent on documentation that was often incomplete and sometimes deliberately falsified. This means the true number will probably never be known. We can only speculate based on patterns, suspicious circumstances that mirror confirmed cases, financial anomalies that suggest preparation for disappearance, sightings that seem more credible than typical fan fantasies. Even then, speculation isn't proof. It's just probability suggesting more secrets exist than we've uncovered. Some cases seem particularly likely. A romantic lead from the 1940s, whose death by heart attack at 38 was attributed to congenital defect, except no previous records showed heart problems. His body was cremated within 24 hours. His estate showed the same financial patterns seen in confirmed cases, or the character actress who supposedly died in a house fire in 1952. The fire started unusually. The body was identified only by location and jewelry, and 3 witnesses later reported seeing her in Canada. There's a television actor from the 1970s whose death by car accident has never sat right with researchers. The car went off a cliff on a road he'd driven hundreds of times. No witnesses. Body severely damaged. Closed casket funeral. But his partner in a long-term secret relationship, interviewed years later, smiled when asked about the death and said only, "I hope he found what he was looking for." The emphasis on hope, not "I hope he's at peace," but "I hope he found," suggests continuing existence. These cases exist in a liminal space between rumor and fact. Enough evidence to wonder, not enough to confirm. They're the ones that keep researchers up at night, checking old newspapers, interviewing elderly witnesses, looking for the crack in the story that would expose the truth. But here's the darker possibility. Some of those ghosts might still be alive right now. Someone who faked their death in 1975 would be in their 70s or 80s today. They could be living in a retirement community, shopping at grocery stores, completely ordinary and completely hidden. Imagine it. The famous actor from your childhood actually teaching English in Toronto. The bombshell actress actually running a bed and breakfast in Vermont. The action star actually working security in Phoenix. All alive, all aging normally, all living under names you wouldn't recognize. They would look different now. Age changes everyone. And they'd have had additional changes. Deliberate weight gain or loss, different hairstyles, perhaps minor plastic surgery. But the eyes would be the same. The gestures might be familiar if you paid attention. The voice, if you heard it, might trigger recognition. But you wouldn't pay attention. Why would you? That actor died 50 years ago. This is just an elderly person, unremarkable, ordering coffee or walking a dog or sitting on a park bench. Your brain wouldn't even consider the possibility because the possibility seems impossible. That's the perfect hiding place, not remote locations, but plain sight, obscurity amid ordinary life. The assumption that dead means dead creates a blind spot in perception. We don't look for ghosts among the living. The question becomes, if you discovered one, what would you do? You're in a cafe and you notice something about the elderly person behind the counter. The way they hold a cup, the profile when they turn, the distinctive gesture you've seen 1,000 times in old movies. You realize with growing certainty that this person is supposed to be dead? Do you say something, expose them, destroying the life they built, prove you were right, but shatter their peace? Or do you stay silent, honoring their choice, letting them continue their ordinary existence? Do they deserve exposure or protection? Most people, if they found themselves in this situation, would probably convince themselves they were mistaken. It's easier to believe you're wrong than to believe you've discovered someone who successfully faked their death decades ago. Easier and kinder. Because what would you gain from the truth except the destruction of someone's carefully constructed life? So the ghosts continue walking among us, if they exist at all, serving your food, teaching your children, fixing your plumbing, living lives of deliberate ordinariness. They're in their 70s and 80s now. These last survivors of Hollywood's golden age. Each year, more die genuinely, taking their secrets to graves that finally hold their actual bodies. Soon, there will be none left. The last ghost will fade into death. The final secret will go untold, and we'll never know how many there were. How many chose freedom over fame? How many died on paper to live in reality? How many traded everything for the simple blessing of anonymity? They made their choices. They lived with the consequences. And in the end, they got what they wanted: to be left alone, to be forgotten, to live and die as themselves, rather than as images. That seems worth respecting, even in our curiosity. Let them rest, those who are dead, and those who only pretended to be. They earned their peace, one way or another. And maybe the real question isn't who they were, but who they became. Not the stars we remember, but the ordinary people they chose to be instead. The ghosts walk among us still, perhaps. Or perhaps they're all finally gone, genuinely dead at last, their secrets buried with them. Either way, their story ends the same. In silence, in obscurity, in the ordinary life they craved. And really, isn't that the perfect ending?